We have been studying the 5th chapter of Numbers, and I promise you we'll actually finish it today. It's the story of a woman suspected of adultery, but who does not confess it. And this is an entirely different situation from a woman who has been caught in the act by her husband. There are witnesses, and the woman does not proclaim her innocence. And in the second case, the procedure is pretty simple. She's taken outside the camp and stoned to death. Bada bing, bada boom. Done. But in the first case, a trial has to be held to determine guilt or innocence since the facts are in doubt. But in the first case, since there's only suspicion and no witnesses, how does one go about determining if this woman's telling the truth and she has remained faithful to her husband? The answer, the law of Numbers 5 prescribes, is a trial by God. The elements of the trial are these. The woman's suspicious husband brings her to the tabernacle, and a Levite priest will then conduct a special ritual as part of the procedure. The ritual consists of a priest writing an oath on a scroll and then washing it off into a cup of water. The water is called holy water in many translations, but in fact, holy water is just the same thing as living water. That is, living water is water from a moving source, like a river or a stream or an artesian fountain. Living water is required for all holy priestly rituals, thus it's called holy water. Then some dust is gathered off of the tabernacle floor. That's put into the cup of water, along with the ink of the letters of the oath. Understand that the key to the letters of the oath is God's name. An oath is not an oath if God's name is not invoked. The woman drinks the water, and then only the passing of time gives the results. If the woman is never able to bear children, she was guilty, and this is her punishment. If she's able to have children, she was innocent, and the children are her reward. Now, last week we read a well-known New Testament story about a group of men who brought to Jesus a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery, and they wanted to know what Jesus was going to do about it. And let's review that story, because I think it has a firm connection to Numbers 5 as its underlying meaning. In fact, we're going to spend considerable time today on this New Testament passage as a means of demonstrating the necessity of knowing Torah before we seriously consider a study of the New Testament. So, open your Bibles once again to John 8. John 8. And if you have a complete Jewish Bible, it's going to be on page 1340. John 8. But Yeshua went to the Mount of Olives. At daybreak, he appeared again in the temple court, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. And the Torah teachers and the Parshim, the Pharisees, brought in a woman who'd been caught committing adultery and made her stand in the center of the group. And then they said to him, Rabbi, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now, in our Torah, Moshe commanded that such a woman be stoned to death. What do you say about it? They said it to trap him, so that they might have grounds for bringing charges against him. But Yeshua bent down and he began writing in the dust with his finger. And when they kept questioning him, he straightened up. He said to them, the one of you who's without sin, let him be the first to throw the stone at her. Then he bent down and he wrote in the dust again. And on hearing this, they began to leave, one by one, the older ones first, until he was left alone with the woman still there. And standing up, Yeshua said to her, well, where are they? Has no one condemned you? She said, no one, sir. And Yeshua said, neither do I condemn you. Now go and sin no more. This story in the New Testament book of John must be taken in the context of the Torah, as should all stories and observations and commentaries about the New Testament. If we try to separate this event that we just read from our understanding that Yeshua was a Torah-observant Jew, operating in a Jewish society, dealing almost exclusively with fellow Jews, and he himself is the author of the Torah, which we seem to forget a lot, then we're going to miss the point on many of the things written about him and in many of his recorded sayings. The dragging of this woman accused of adultery before Jesus was simply a test. We're told so. It was a trap by these rabbis and scribes who brought her to see if they could get him to say something against the law of Moses, and so he would be automatically discredited. It was a political ploy in a time of great political upheaval, temple corruption, and intrigue in Judea. Now, there are some things that need to be carefully explored about this story if we're going to grasp its meaning, its true meaning. And first, I will understand that this is one of the most beloved stories in the New Testament, so I'm probably going to tread on some folks' feelings about it. And I apologize in advance for challenging the conventional wisdom on this. I hope you caught my wink. This passage is most typically used to demonstrate a couple of things. First, that Jesus is all merciful, and then second, that sinners have no right to judge anybody else. That's usually the way it's presented. That's the conclusions. And those conclusions have become doctrines and mainstays of Christian institutions. Now, we can debate on another occasion as to whether one or both or neither of those conclusions ought to be proper Christian doctrines. But today, I'm going to suggest to you that the point of this particular story in John chapter 8 has nothing to do with Yeshua's mercy, has even less to do of any kind of requirement that only sinless people ought to witness against another person, or those who can rightfully carry out, or be those who can rightfully carry out judicial punishment upon others. Let's look at what happened here, because there are some oddities about this story that have perplexed and upset scholars and Bible translators for centuries. This unnamed woman is brought before Yeshua, and he is told she's committed adultery. And since her guilt isn't apparently the issue, the only question these men have for Yeshua is what he thinks her punishment ought to be. In the most accepted traditional Christian interpretations of this passage, the outcome essentially has Yeshua telling these men that unless they have lived a sin-free life, they have no right to accuse her of sin or adultery or to carry out any kind of judicial punishment on this woman for her sin. In this case, stoning her. Further, after these men have skulked away from the area in shame, Jesus determines in his mercy to ignore the crime that the woman has committed, which according to the law is among the worst of sins that can be committed. Lets her off the hook, says to be on her way and not sin anymore. There are to be no repercussions because Jesus determined there shouldn't be any. And the story is explained as a great demonstration of his limitless mercy and love for us. Now, while I certainly believe in a merciful Savior, and I am deeply grateful for that indispensable attribute of his limitless love, I see the application of mercy and pardon as an improbable interpretation of this rather problematic story. Let me tell you something that most folks don't realize. It is that this particular story that we just read about Yeshua has so troubled Bible councils and Bible interpreters that to this day you won't even find it in some Bible translations. It's been removed. The controversial narrative that this has been removed and then added back into the New Testament canon, only to be removed again and then included many times over the centuries. Why? Because what is stated simply doesn't add up. It doesn't seem to follow the pattern of Jesus' life. His pronouncements don't match with this. His actions don't match with this. And it even calls into question his compliance to the very Torah that he and all the apostles claim that he followed perfectly. That we also know he's the author of it. Here's the basic problem. Absolutely no element of trust or faith in Yeshua as the Messiah, as the Son of God, is even involved in this narrative. Belief was never asked of this woman. It's not even implied that this woman had any idea who Yeshua was. She offered no acknowledgement of his status as the Messiah or of him being a divine being. She didn't ask for forgiveness, nor was it offered, per se. The second problem is that adultery was a God-ordained capital offense, as found in the Torah. Adultery wasn't just a social faux pas and a family disgrace. It was a serious civil crime. It was so serious, it was part of the foundational principles for the entire Bible. The 10 Commandments, Exodus 20:13. Do not commit murder and do not commit adultery. Adultery was so heinous in God's eyes that it was put on the same level as murder in its seriousness. Leviticus 20:10. If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, that is, with the wife of a fellow countryman, both the adulterer and the adulteress must be put to death. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. A woman and a man commits adultery, they're to be executed. Now, I wonder if Yeshua was familiar with the law of Moses. Think maybe he agreed with it? John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was God. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing had been made. Jesus is the Word of God. He wrote the Torah. So it's kind of hard to imagine that he was now disavowing its contents. See, here's the thing. We'll find no other story about Yeshua that even remotely implies that he just dismisses civil and criminal lawbreakers from their responsibility of their crimes. Rather, he rescued folks from the eternal spiritual consequences of their trespasses. But there was always a caveat. Faith in him as God's Messiah. No trust in Yeshua, no forgiveness, no redemption. Yet by most Christian interpretations, that's what happened here. For some reason, Yeshua just waved his hand, dismissed the crime of adultery, which is called a high-handed sin in the Bible, and said, don't do it anymore. Unlikely. And now you see why this story is so controversial, and it's even been removed from many Bible translations. Now, there's a second aspect of this to consider. And it involves the let he who is without sin cast the first stone comment. See, the standard interpretation would have it that as sinners, we have no business pointing out the sin in anybody else. Some have gone so far as to say that in its strictest sense, Christ is teaching that only a completely sinless person can be a reliable witness to a crime. Or that only a completely sinless person can be a person who orders judicial punishment. or that only a completely sinless person can execute capital punishment. And such an idea is simply unworkable. It would bring any justice system to a standstill. But that standard, by that standard, no one, nobody can be accused, tried, convicted, or punished, because there's no such thing as a sinless person to prosecute criminals. Therefore, this common interpretation doesn't pass the smell test. It can't be correct. As many scholars have complained for literally hundreds and hundreds of years. Something's wrong here. However, I do think the story should not be removed because it happened. And it was absolutely correctly recorded, I believe. I believe the problem lies in trying to make it fit a predisposed agenda rather than interpreting it in its Jewish cultural context. Notice the circumstances. It is said by the accusers that she was caught in the act of adultery. That's what they said. What was their purpose for being there? Was it an honest purpose? It was to trap Jesus. So my question is, was she caught in the act of adultery? Because they said so? Were these upright and honorable men who brought this woman to Yeshua? No. These were representatives of a notorious and corrupt temple system that sought to rid itself of this upstart young rabbi named Yeshua, who was making their lives a whole lot harder. There is no way to know for sure whether this accusation of the group was true. I suspect that these men likely did not make a truthful statement, or certainly the woman's husband would have been there to make the accusation. In fact, by the law, that was required. Add to that, we hear no admission of guilt from this woman. There's not one word of it recorded. She was just silent. And further, Christ told her to go and sin no more, not to go and not commit adultery anymore. But assuming the unlikely, that it was a truthful statement that she had actually been caught in the act, Torah required there has to be at least 2 witnesses, and in the case of adultery, one of them must be her husband, who had to testify against a person accused of a capital crime. And of course, adultery was a capital crime. But even more, it was required that the witnesses in a capital case had to initiate the execution process. If this were applied to modern day, it would be the equivalent of the witnesses who were required to pull the lever for the gas chamber. They were the ones that would have to fire the first bullet in a firing squad. The standard this is not tradition, this is the law of Moses. The standard Jewish method of execution was stoning, and it was a requirement of Torah that the accusing witnesses were not only present at the execution, they had to be the very first ones to throw the stones at the condemned person. The person convicted by means of their testimony. There was a reason for this. It was a deterrent to false testimony. If a witness lied and falsely accused, and it led to the death of an innocent person, then by their being part of the execution process, they'd have blood on their hands. They have legally, and according to the Torah law, become murderers. And they would themselves be subject to execution. That's a pretty big incentive not to give false or frivolous testimony in a capital case. Thus we have Jesus saying, "Let he who is without sin throw the first stone." Who always throws the first stone in a Jewish execution? Who? The witnesses. In my opinion, When Yeshua said who is without sin, he wasn't referring to just sin in general, any old sin. He was referring to the sin of bearing false witness. And maybe to some degree these men's impure motives for making this accusation and dragging this poor woman there in the first place. In this instance, what was the purpose of the false witness? It was to entrap Yeshua. The story itself says so. Yeshua called their bluff in a manner that would make Perry Mason proud. See, he didn't question anyone. He didn't even call anyone a liar. He just said, okay, guys, assuming you haven't sinned by giving a false witness, why just go ahead and pick up the stone and start throwing them at her now? Be my guest. Because if they were lying or just going along with an assumption of this woman's guilt without actually knowing and got caught, now they'd be capital punishment. I think there is nothing here but a false accusation using a helpless woman who probably wasn't of the best character in order to try to discredit a rival, Jesus of Nazareth. Justice wasn't the issue. Getting rid of Yeshua was the issue. And we need to understand just how rampant adultery was in Jesus' day, and that only women needed to fear the accusation. The charge of adultery had become a joke. Everybody was doing it. The usual consequence for a woman accused of adultery now was divorce, not death. No proof of adultery was necessary for a man to divorce his wife, just suspicion. But by Yeshua's day, only a husband could be the aggrieved party. Men were simply no longer brought up on charges of adultery, even though Leviticus clearly states that both men and women caught in adultery were to be executed. The concept of a woman being accused of adultery and being divorced instead of being executed for this adultery, now that was tradition. That wasn't Torah. Men had decided that execution was just too harsh for this all too common crime. This is but one small example of what Judaism had become. So since there's no hint that this woman had confessed to her supposed crime, the law says she should have been taken to the priests, who would have performed the Numbers 5 water ordeal upon her. Now, if I'm correct, that the story about John 8 is more about the law of Numbers 5 than anything else, a good question surrounding the story of Jesus and the woman accused of adultery would be, was the water ordeal still being practiced in the New Testament era 1,300 years after it was first enacted? And yes, it was. And we find proof of it in the Mishnah in Sota 9, where we find that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai eventually outlawed it. He wrote the Mishnah around 200 AD. And Rabbi ben Zakkai outlawed it because it had become so misused and abused by husbands who simply wanted to be rid of their wives that they would just go ahead and accuse their wives of adultery. The wives would go through the water ordeal, and no matter what the outcome, they'd still divorce them because it would take years, perhaps, before it was known if the woman might become barren, which was the supernatural indication of guilt. And the husband didn't want to wait. He wanted a quickie divorce. Now, another interesting little thing. I've heard of some of the most amazing and I think inventive suggestions on just what it was that Yeshua was writing in the dust with his finger, as it says in verse 6 of John 8. And even though nothing more is ever said about Yeshua writing in the dust in the New Testament, it has for some reason captured the imaginations of Christian pastors and teachers. So let's address it. In Numbers 5, we find that the focal point of the water ordeal ritual is a special drink. And we find there are 3 ingredients to this water concoction the accused woman is supposed to swallow: holy water, dust, and the ink from the letters of a vow that the priest has written as to her punishment if she did what she was accused of doing. What exactly is holy water? It's just a synonym for living water. Holy water only indicates it's water that's been drawn from a running spring or a river and then designated for use at the temple. From a practical standpoint, holy water was but the water that filled that copper laver in the temple. The same water priests used to dip from to wash their feet and their hands during temple ritual. Holy water and living water are 2 terms for the same thing. So added to this flask of living water was dust gathered from where? The temple floor. Why did it need to be dust from the temple floor? Because the dust had to be holy. The temple was God's dwelling place. And anywhere God dwells contracts his holiness. Remember in Exodus, as Moses approached the burning bush, what it was instructed that Moses had to do and why? Moses had to remove his sandals from his feet because he was about to stand on holy ground, literally on holy dust. Why was this dust holy, but dust just a little bit further away wasn't? Because God was present at the bush. So the dirt beneath God's feet, so to speak, the dirt that formed the floor of his dwelling place, the tabernacle, later the temple, was automatically made holy, and therefore it was that holy dust that was required to be put into this drink concoction. Now, as for the ink of the letters, that was the last part to go into it. It was required that God's name, Yud-He-Vav-He, be written on a sheepskin scroll as part of the oath that the woman swore to. We don't read that directly in the Torah that the letters of God's name was written, but it doesn't matter because it's a given. A biblical oath by definition always includes God's name. If God's name on it, it isn't an oath. Just as when we write a letter to somebody today, we write our name at the end of that letter. When we say to someone, I wrote a letter to so-and-so, we don't have to say, oh, and by the way, I signed my name to it. It's a given. Same thing with an oath. A biblical oath is not just the making of a statement. A biblical oath is the invoking of God's name as a validation and witness of your statement. It's calling upon God to be the guarantor of your promise. Therefore, when the ink of that written oath was immediately washed off into the holy water, God's name flowed into it as an ingredient. Now hear me on this. This isn't allegory that I'm giving you. This is accurate historical fact, well attested to in many ancient Jewish writings. Now, certainly this ritual water mixture is symbolic because there's no magical quality about the ink and the water and the dust, but what I'm telling you is not conjecture. It is what was recorded in those times about the procedures and the meaning of each step. So the drink that a woman accused of adultery swallowed then consisted of living water, kind of water required for all holy rituals, dust made holy by God's presence, that's from the temple floor, and the letters of God's holy name. See, here's the thing. What in the world does dust, and Yeshua writing in the dust with his finger, have to do with this story of he and the accused woman? Everything, if we know the Torah. Because in Numbers 5, when a woman was brought before the priest and God to be judged as to whether she was actually guilty of adultery or not, dust and writing were the central parts of the ritual. We see every element of the law of Numbers 5 in the John 8 story of Yeshua and the woman accused of adultery. We have living water. Where do we find living water in this story? Yeshua. A priest and God was present. Yeshua. Holy dust. Where was Jesus at this time? He was in the temple, and we're told there was dust on the floor because he was writing in it with his finger, wasn't he? The woman was indeed brought before God, requirement of Numbers 5, when she was brought before Yeshua, though those bringing her didn't realize it. Yeshua was writing in holy dust because as God, he made the very ground he sat upon holy, and besides, he was at the temple courtyard. We're told this in the story. What was he writing? Now, I can't be sure, but I suspect it may have been Yud-He, Vav-He, the letters that form God's name. That would have been the most consistent with the pattern set down from Numbers 5, but I admit that's my speculation. Yeshua was simply displaying the real and the original Torah. The Torah is given to Moses on Mount Sinai. The Torah we are studying together. And as Christ so eloquently stated in the Sermon on the Mount, he was on earth but to act out the meaning of the Torah. Yeshua, who is living water, who is also priest in God, writing on holy dust with a woman accused of adultery standing before him. This story is in many ways an irony. In John 8, these corrupt men had brought this woman before God for judgment. They didn't even recognize what they were doing. Before them was every ingredient of the God-ordained ritual of the water ordeal upon a woman accused of adultery. Priest, God, holy water, holy dust, holy writings, all performed at the required location, the temple. I hope you see this. Those Pharisees and rabbis who dragged that poor woman before Yeshua couldn't see what was actually occurring here because they were blind to their own Messiah, equally blind to the laws and commands of the Torah that they had largely replaced by now with their own traditions. Listening to the last 3 verses of Number 5, see if you can just kind of picture this in your mind. With this woman standing there before Yeshua in the story of John 8. Listen to this in Numbers 5:29. This is the law of jealousy. When a wife, being under the authority of her husband, goes astray and defiles herself, or when a spirit of jealousy comes over a man and he's jealous of his wife, he shall then make the woman stand before the Lord. And the priest shall apply all of this law to her. And moreover, the man shall be free from guilt, but the woman shall bear her guilt. Indeed, the Torah was followed. She stood before the Lord, and the priest, our high priest in this case, applied all the law to her. Yeshua, seeing no witnesses against her, no one to condemn her, which is the requirement of the law of proven adultery in Leviticus, then moved, as a good rabbi, to the law of suspected adultery of Numbers 5, the test of the water ordeal. And then each and every element of it, water, dust, and writing, was used. Of course, as he was God on earth, there was less need that she drink a holy water mixture and wait for the results as a sign of God's judgment in the matter. And when Jesus tells the men who had brought the woman to him, "He is without sin, cast the first stone." Remember, it was the witnesses who threw the first stones of an execution. This was the law. This was not tradition. Listen to this in Deuteronomy 17, starting at verse 5. Then you shall bring out that man or that woman who has done this evil deed to your gates, that is, the man or the woman, and you shall stone them to death. And on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, he who is to die shall be put to death. He shall not be put to death on the evidence of 1 witness. The hand of the witnesses shall be the first one to put him to death. And then afterward, the hand of all the people. So shall you purge evil from your midst. My dear friends, almost everything that happened with Yeshua in the New Testament is completely explainable by means of the Torah. We don't have to resort to allegory and fanciful stories with dubious conclusions to defend the Bible. We don't need to remove stories that make no sense to us and don't seem to confirm our doctrines. We just need to study the Bible, the whole Word, and then make the connections and bring forth the patterns. Now, since Numbers chapter 5 and John chapter 8 are largely about the subject of adultery, there is one final aspect of this I'd like to bring out. It is that the law of adultery assumes that one partner in the relationship is unfaithful and the other one is not. Let me quote Joseph Milgram, who says that the rabbis read the laws concerning adultery in exactly that way. If the man is clear of sin, then the woman convicted of adultery shall suffer her guilt. And that view is based largely on Hosea 4. The idea being that if a man was being unfaithful to his wife, then the wife's unfaithfulness merits no punishment. Listen to Hosea 4, starting at verse 14. Therefore your daughters behave like whores. Your daughters-in-law commit adultery. I won't punish your daughters when they act like whores, or your daughters-in-law when they commit adultery, because the men are themselves going off with whores and sacrificing with prostitutes. Yes, people without understanding will come to ruin. Marriage is the institution that God designed as a way to explain and to demonstrate the relationship between himself and us. The definition of what adultery amounts to, what the effects and consequences are for it, are placed in the Torah to protect the God-ordained institution of marriage. But these same effects and consequences caused by adultery upon a human marriage between a man and a woman also paint a picture of what happens when we commit adultery against God. The biblical term we see used in Numbers 5 and elsewhere in the Bible for this is breaking faith. Adultery in a human marriage is breaking faith between a husband and a wife. Over and over again, we are told in the Bible that when we break faith with God, when we worship other gods, when we choose the way of the world over the way of the Lord, when we decide to dedicate ourselves to religious doctrines, to very nice sounding traditions, instead of to the actual Word of God as laid down in the Scripture, and when we violate his laws and commandments, we are breaking faith with him. Over and over, we are told in the Word that God is faithful. He never breaks faith with us. He never changes. He's just always just and loving. If God were ever to be unfaithful towards us, think about this, it would invalidate the entire biblical concept of adultery and breaking faith. Without the faithfulness of one of the partners, then adultery has no meaning. If God is unfaithful to us, it becomes impossible for us to be unfaithful to him. Let me repeat that. If God ever becomes unfaithful to us, then the entire premise of our relationship with him goes down the drain. Fortunately, we never have to worry about that, because God's not a man that he might change or ever be tempted. Therefore, from the rabbi's point of view, and I think they're dead on in their thinking, Adultery in a marriage only has meaning if one party remains faithful and the other becomes unfaithful. If both are unfaithful, adultery becomes a non sequitur. This is why Rabbi Zochanan ben Zakkai abolished the water ordeal of the suspected adulteress of Numbers 5, because men had long ago excused themselves from having to be faithful to their wives. The Jewish men saw adultery as a one-way street. Only women could be unfaithful. Men had no obligations to remain pure in their marriages. In effect, there was no adultery because there was no faithfulness. This is reflected in the New Testament statement of Yeshua, who said in Matthew 5:31, "And it was said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife except for the cause of unchastity makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Here Yeshua makes it clear, despite what you may think the remainder of this instruction concerning divorce is indicating, that unfaithfulness destroys the entire marriage dynamic. When Christ was addressing the crowds and he was talking about adultery, it wasn't because it was a rarity in Jewish society. It was the norm, just as it has become so again. We're still maybe in our time. And we'll start Numbers chapter 6 next time. Please rise.
Yeshua.